So I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Gaia Zanaboni. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently an intern at Sterre in the Netherlands, and I mainly helped organize this event. So I'm very excited to see that it's happening. And I originally come from Italy, but now I've been living in the Netherlands for 2 years. And I am also a youth advocate for Choice for Youth and Sexuality, in case people know it. And I'm very happy to be here today and to be the moderator. Also, my colleague, Nicole Moran, the program coordinator at Sterre in the Netherlands, will be the technical host today. And she will oversee the chat and support with Zoom. So thanks, Nicole, for your support. And I'm also excited to be sharing this space today with our young researchers, Elena Soldati, Saskia Jacobs, Silke Baas, and Sterre van Ede. And we present their research later, and I want to thank you again for being here. And we also have an expert today that will draw links between research and policy and practice, Judith Westeng. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And thank you too for being here today. Okay, now I can start by introducing ShareNet and today's conference. And after, I will pass on the word to our students and that we share the research. And by the way, if you have any questions at any point for me or for the speakers or Judith, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And then we will answer them towards the end of the session, because we have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So you can also just send messages in the chat throughout the session. Okay, so ShareNet International is a knowledge platform for sexual and reproductive health and rights. The network is composed of all kinds of stakeholders that work in the sexual and reproductive health and rights field, and it is funded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And if you want to know more, please consult our brand new digital platform for networking opportunities in the sexual and reproductive health and rights field. Now Nicole will share the link in the chat. And in particular, ShareNet shares the vision that links between evidence-based research, policy, and practice need to be strengthened. This is also the main objective of today's conference. Linking research, policy, and practice brings together policymakers, practitioners, and researchers working on the sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender equality and women's empowerment in international development. And this year, it's a very special occasion because it's the 10th anniversary of this event, and we celebrate with a festive international online edition. And indeed, this edition culminates with a collaborative conference of all the ShareNet hubs. So Bangladesh, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Colombia, Ethiopia, Jordan, and the Netherlands. So I really hope that you were able to attend one of the other sessions already, or that you can join us later in the following sessions. And we also have networking events that we will share with you later in the end. So now we'll explain a bit the agenda for today. First, we're going to have 4 presentations that are all focused on the Dutch context. And after our expert discussant, we react to each one of the speakers by answering the question, how do these research findings and recommendation for policy and practice resonate? How could they be taken up? This will be then followed by a Q&A, so please remember that you're free to leave any questions in the chat at any moment. And once again, I want to thank you all for being here, and the speakers for their presentations, the expert discussants, and my colleague. Thank you all. And now I would like to introduce the first speaker of today's session, Elena Soldati. Elena is in her last year of Master of Medicine at University of Groningen that she actually finished yesterday, she announced before, so congratulations. And is originally from Italy. Judith's research is the product of her master thesis that was done at the Department of Global Health and Gynecology and Obstetrics of the University of Groningen. Good luck, Elena. You can now share your slides.
Well, hello everyone, I'm Elena Soldati. I would like to thank the organizer of this event to let me present today. Together with my colleagues, I performed a qualitative study on mental health screening for pregnant asylum seekers. I'm sorry, I can't go through the slides. Sorry. Well, why is it important to screen a pregnant asylum seeker? Well, the prevalence of mental health conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, or depression in this population is almost as high as 50%. Moreover, all these conditions are related to worse pregnancy outcomes, such as preterm birth, of a higher admittance to the intensive neonatal care unit, or I'm sorry. Or higher admittance to the intensive care unit. Therefore, screening in early pregnancy is extremely important, and it should also be transculturally validated in this specific population group. In this research, we decided to use the Refugee Healthcare Screener 15, which is a transculturally validated screening tool for post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. It is available in multiple languages online. These are some examples of how the Refugee Healthcare Screener 15 looks like. The research question was to investigate pregnant asylum seeker perception on antenatal screening for mental health and to investigate whether the RHS 15 could be a suitable screening instrument to them. To do this, we performed a qualitative study and we collected the data between November and December 2020 in Ter Apel, which is the biggest asylum seeker center in the Netherlands. First, the pregnant asylum seeker filled in the RHS 15. Afterwards, their opinion on the screening by healthcare worker in general and also on the RHS 15 in specific were investigated via semi-structured interviews. All these interviews were audio recorded, translated, and transcribed literally. The data from these semi-structured interviews was analyzed by two independent researchers. First, we did a thematic analysis. First, we assigned a code to all the important fragments in the text. Afterwards, we checked throughout all the different interviews for similarities between all these fragments, which is called axial coding. And finally, we checked all these codes for validity. From all these codes emerge three main core labels or themes, which will answer our research questions. This whole process was checked one more time by a third researcher. The pregnant asylum seekers also answered an anonymous questionnaire on their psychosocial and obstetrics history. In total, we performed 8 interviews to reach saturation on a thematic level with the women from various different countries. Some of them had complications in the past pregnancy, and most of them were a victim of abuse, either mental, physical, or both. 3 of them were already diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder in the country of origin. Our main theme is about the importance of mental health screening. All the women interviewed thought it was extremely important for them to be screened because they recognize how their position of pregnant asylum seeker put them in a more vulnerable position and therefore more susceptible for mental health condition. Then they also told us that they would not start a conversation on mental health screening spontaneously if they were not asked beforehand by a healthcare worker, for example, by means of a mental health screening. They all agreed that the healthcare provider should be aware of their condition and past trauma, and they will also accept treatment following the screening if required necessary. Our second theme is about talking about mental health. All the women interviewed once asked in a proper way, say they were all willing to share their past stories and traumas and talk about their own mental health. They also shared with us a few barriers and facilitators in order to talk more freely about mental health. Some examples are a language barrier, which will be overcome by the use of an interpreter, or the healthcare provider showing genuine interest and also using enough time to hear out the woman. Our last main theme or core label is about the use of the RHS 15. All the women interviewed, they thought it was a very good way to start talking about mental health because the questions asked in the screening test related well to their situation, and they were also not too triggering a strong emotion regarding their past traumas. They gave us some tips on how to best implement it. For example, they say they will all appreciate their midwife to take the screening test as they have the most contact with their midwife. They will also be okay with this test being taken during the first appointment. They also thought it was very suitable to them because they could relate very well to the question asked, and because they will also always recommend the screening test to another pregnant asylum seeker. In conclusion, a mental health screening test is extremely important during pregnancy according to pregnant asylum seeker. And the RHS 15 is an acceptable and suitable method to screen them, always according to them. However, the presence of an interpreter is important in order to answer any possible question that arise from the screening test. However, to fully implement it in a routine care for these women, further research is necessary, mainly to see how sustainable it is by also interviewing, for example, healthcare providers that are in close contact with this population group. I would like to end with a quote from one of our participants. If you're alone as a pregnant woman in a different country, you can also be depressed. If you don't have people around to help you and guide you, you're alone to deal with this kind of issues that can be new for you. You need the support and help to keep it up with this pregnancy because it's a very long journey. Well, thank you very much. I would like to mention that all the drawings in these slides were done by artist Kevin Moreno-Kiernan. He made these drawings specifically for this research project. And if you want to get in touch with me, here is the email.
Perfect. Thank you, Elena. That was really inspiring. Thank you for sharing. Now I would like to move on to the next speaker, Saskia Jacobs. Saskia conducted her research thesis at the University of Groningen about the theme of sex work. Welcome. Are you there, Saskia? We cannot hear you. Okay, Saskia's microphone is not working. Do you have headphones or something? Okay, now I can hear you.
Good. That's working. Excellent. Hello. Sorry about that. I'm Saskia Jacobs, she, her. Right, I guess I better just get started given the time limit. So, as you can maybe see from my beautiful artwork there, I did my research on how sex workers in Amsterdam experience tourism to Amsterdam using the concept of the host gaze. How do I go to the next slide? Thank you. Now, without getting into too much of the details of what the host gaze is, this concept from tourism studies mainly looks at how tourists are perceived by a host community and how these hosts interact with tourists and how these perceptions and interactions influence each other. Now, based on the literature on the host gaze, these boxes on the left here were found to be important influencing the perceptions of tourists. I won't go through them all, but I think it's fairly self-explanatory why these things would be important in influencing the way tourists are seen. Next slide, please. So how did I actually do my research? I chose Amsterdam because, well, it has this international reputation for sex work, obviously. But due to practical limitations caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, I had to expand my research area a bit to include the suburbs as well, so that I'd be able to interview a few more people. And although Amsterdam's famous for the window brothels, I also interviewed other types of sex workers like escorts and dominatrixes. So in total, I interviewed 15 different sex workers, and I further did 4 expert interviews with people who are very familiar with sex work. Next slide, please. So let's go back to that model from a moment ago. What did I actually find? Now, all these things did come up to some degree. 2 really stood out, and those were the power relations and the differentiation aspects. The perceived impact of tourism also came up, of course, but similar to a lot of previous research on the host case, that mainly boiled down to tourists bringing in money, and with some tourists being loud and obnoxious drunks, but the money ultimately being valued more. So let's instead focus on the more interesting things. Next slide. Let's start with the differentiation aspect, because to understand how tourists were seen, we have to understand how locals are seen, and that generally wasn't great. Although some participants saw the locals as nice and respectful, most of the participants described them as being cheap and entitled. This appeared to be irrespective of the form of work, where in the region they worked, or how many of their clients were locals. They in general just weren't appreciated. I'm very sorry to say this to any Dutch people in the audience, but the Dutch would just not appreciate it. Next slide. Tourists, on the other hand, although certainly differences were described between different countries, were largely described far more positively. They spent more money, were often nicer, and some tourists, like Arabian or American tourists in particular, would even leave tips. By far, the American was easily the most valued of all the different tourist clients. Now, some of the participants liked their personalities, while others thought they were even more entitled and demanding than the Dutch. But the crucial difference between the Americans and the Dutch was that the Americans were not cheap. The average American client appeared to spend anywhere between 2 to 5 times as much as the average Dutch client. Whatever personality flaws the American may have, a lot can be forgiven when they pay several times more than the locals. And I think that's an important point, actually. Sex work, as the name implies, is work. And these people do this work to make a living, so it would only make sense then that those people who pay the most would be the most appreciated. Next slide. So, moving on to the other aspect of power relations. Unlike in previous research on the host gaze, which mainly focused on people working in hospitality, such as restaurants or hotel workers, those people generally have little ability to reprimand the customers if they behave poorly, because they might get fired. In this case, though, power relations were a lot more favorably skewed towards the sex workers, because they wouldn't get fired if they reprimanded a particular client. Let's see, hang on, I lost my train of thought for a moment. Yeah. So further, the legality of sex work, along with the work environment of a brothel or the presence of co-workers, also meant that any physical threat from clients was generally fairly minimal. And further, another thing that really favored them was that there was generally a decent amount of clients in Amsterdam. More clients, of course, means more money, but it also means that refusing any particular clients won't be as much of a problem because it won't impact your income as much. During the pandemic, this changed, of course, and those who did work during this time were less able to be as picky with their clients as they simply wouldn't make enough money then to pay the bills. Next slide. So this is also what makes Amsterdam different in terms of sex work when comparing it to the literature on sex work elsewhere in the world. So there's this concept of bounded authenticity, which Bernstein came up with back in 2007 while studying sex work in America. Now, bounded authenticity is basically about putting on a performance that has to seem authentic, doesn't have to be authentic, but has to seem authentic to a particular audience. And the basic point of it is to present yourself in a certain way that will make people spend more money. That was and still is quite a big thing in sex work in America and in many other countries. It's fairly common in sex work to do a lot of branding and to have this entire work persona worked out with its own separate backgrounds, identity, politics, hobbies, you name it. But it wasn't really the case in Amsterdam. Some did do some of this branding, but to a far lesser degree than in many other countries. And some participants even explicitly said that they were the same person outside of sex work as they are inside of sex work. So in my discussions with both my research participants and with the various experts, we came up with three main reasons that explains this difference between Amsterdam and the rest of the world. First, there's the legality of sex work. Part of this branding process is often about distancing oneself from the illegality of sex work, but that obviously isn't necessary in the Netherlands. Second, there was less pressure for sex workers in Amsterdam to make as much money as possible because the social safety net is, well, certainly flawed, particularly for sex workers, still a lot stronger in the Netherlands than in many other countries. And third, tourism. There simply are more clients in Amsterdam thanks to tourism. And even other large cities across the world, the sex work market tends to generally be fairly localized. But Amsterdam has access to a global market, really. Because of that, I believe that tourism has actually led to an improvement of the working conditions of sex workers compared to other places. They make more money, they have to do less emotional labor in terms of producing these different work personas, and they have nicer clients because they can be a lot more choosy with who they will and won't take as clients. Next slide. So, based on my research, I have two main policy recommendations for improving the working conditions of sex workers. First, it is crucial that there are safe places for sex workers to do their work legally. The workplaces that already exist should be protected, and if possible, new ones should be made in addition to them. And second, promote tourism. More tourists mean more clients, and that means that the sex workers will make more money, and they will be in a better position to refuse any bad clients. Not all tourists are created equally there, of course, so such promotion efforts should target those tourists who are more willing to spend more money, in this case, the Americans. In particular, travelers coming for like business conferences were often cited as being by far the best type of clients. Next slide. And that was my presentation. Thank you all very kindly for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them later or to send me an email at janemlsmith@gmail.com, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saskia. I'm very glad you could make it in the end because it was a very insightful presentation, and I actually have a question for you later. So thank you. Perfect. And yeah, sorry. The next presentation now will be given by Silke Baas. Silke is originally from the Netherlands, and she did her master thesis at the University of Amsterdam. Welcome, Silke. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, we had a little technical difficulties the last few days, and my son is running around the house, so I pre-recorded my presentation so that you can hear it. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Yes. Okay, and I hope you can hear it. If I play it, if you don't, please let me know. Hi, and thank you for visiting my presentation. I'm Silke, 28 years old, and I just finished my research master in social sciences at the University of Amsterdam. I conducted ethnographic research in a Dutch gender clinic, the Center of Expertise on Gender Dysphoria, located in the VUMC in Amsterdam. Through interviews with clinicians and observations of fertility counseling sessions, I studied how the gender team constructs new reproductive care paths in the transitioning process of trans patients, and how the team navigates the changing legal and social environment that transgender care takes place in. Transgender and trans are umbrella terms for a large set of gender identities and practices that challenge traditional ways of seeing gender and its relationship to sex and sexuality. Trans people do not feel at home in the gender they were assigned at birth, and some, but not all, wish to medically transition so their body matches their gender identity. In this research, I focused on a multidisciplinary gender team that provides medical, social, and psychological care to trans people who do choose medical intervention. This does not make those who choose not to any less valid. Medical care for trans people can consist of hormone therapy, gender-affirming operations, or a combination of the two, and help with the social transitioning process that takes place outside of hospital walls. Since I have only 10 minutes to present, I cannot go into the details surrounding various biomedical techniques and specific options available for trans men, trans women, and non-binary people. If you're interested in this aspect of my research, you can always hit me up since I'm more than happy to discuss it. Both hormone therapy, consisting of feminizing and masculinizing hormones, and gender-affirming operations, can impact future options for genetic parenthood, which is why the Gender Clinic offers various options for fertility preservation. Until 2014, the Dutch state required irreversible sterilization as a requirement for trans people to be able to change their gender on official registration, such as passports. This requirement left trans people with little to no options to pursue genetic parenthood, and consequently left the topic of future fertility as a neglected part of the medical transitioning process. In 2014, a new transgender law came into place that let go of this requirement. The 2014 legislative change, in combination with new biomedical techniques such as egg freezing, opened up new possibilities in trans family planning. Furthermore, clinics specializing in transgender care now had a new task: implementing fertility-preserving care within the transitioning process to secure reproductive potential and open up new options for future genetic parenthood. Since 2016, fertility counseling sessions where reproductive options can be discussed are offered structurally to all people going through the transitioning process. By implementing fertility-preserving techniques into the transitioning process, clinicians lifted the veil of invisibility which covered the topic of trans parenthood in the hospital during the previous decades. If we have time left after my presentation, we can go over the various fertility-preserving options offered at the clinic, but we'll skip over it for now. My research showed that in addition to fertility formerly being a blind spot, there proved to be multiple challenges while developing new reproductive care paths. Gender-affirming treatments can, and often do, impact fertility, which means choices regarding future genetic parenthood have to be made during the transitioning process. When a desire to have children in the future is present, fertility preservation can be a solution to protect reproductive potential while starting transitioning. These topics are discussed at multiple stages during the transitioning process. How much time and space trans people have for decisions regarding fertility is dependent on multiple aspects, including the sex assigned at birth and treatment wishes. Since gender-affirming care can be life-saving and delays in treatment can have big consequences, this leads to a dilemma for clinicians dealing with a young patient population. For younger trans people, decisions regarding future fertility can be complex because the desire to have children typically develops later in life. While early treatment before the onset of puberty is highly recommended to prevent further development of gender dysphoria. In addition, talking about fertility, bodies, and reproductive organs can trigger gender dysphoric feelings, making some trans people hesitant to discussing the topic. While discussing the topic of future fertility, clinicians engage in a balancing act between not wanting to harm their patients with unwanted and triggering information, while at the same time, clinicians feel a great responsibility to convey the gravity of the choice to not secure future reproductive options for genetic parenthood. This dilemma between wanting to respect patient autonomy and feeling medical responsibility to discuss implications of treatment increases in complexity due to various treatment options' impact on reproductive potential and the young age at which patients potentially need to make decisions about future fertility. In addition, clinicians experience a discrepancy between the present-day experiences and needs of trans people currently going through the transitioning process and the offered information in fertility counseling, which anticipates a future often hard to imagine for patients. Furthermore, clinicians name a lack of representation in mainstream family imaginaries as a cause for trans people to envision starting their own family in the future as something unattainable. In addition to the dilemma between gender transitions and future fertility, there prove to be multiple structural barriers on trans people's road to parenthood. Besides difficult decisions about fertility preservation, uncertainty regarding future access to preserved materials and reproductive health can also be viewed as a structural barrier. Due to the sterilization requirements active until 2014, trans people's reproductive desires and future family planning have been understudy topics. This invisibility in research and practice leads to professional organizations showing reservations about offering future reproductive help for trans people through assisted reproductive technologies. These reservations show how policies concerning various reproductive rights and access to fertility-preserving techniques and assisted reproductive technologies, especially for members of the LGBT community, are not created in a vacuum and depend on how LGBT people are accepted within society and if they can count on a juridical and medical framework that protects their rights. Another often named barrier to reproductive help is the gendered workings of fertility clinics, where medical help is often structured based on binary perceptions of father and motherhood. By creating a gender-friendly environment where heteronormative assumptions regarding bodies and their functioning do not predominate, one structural barrier in access to fertility preservation can be taken away. For example, by changing gendered salutations on letters to gender-neutral variants for all patients, the Reproductive Health Department at the VUMC intends to prevent misgendering people who signed up for fertility-preserving or assisted reproductive treatments. In addition, reproductive organs and functions are cut loose from gender when discussing reproductive options with intending parents, which is important as the connection between reproductive organs and gender identity can trigger dysphoric feelings. My research focused on how clinicians construct new reproductive care paths in a changing social, cultural, and political environment. Since access to trans healthcare is still a widely debated topic in Dutch media and politics, the construction of new reproductive care paths takes place in a dynamic and precarious environment. On one side, trans activists are calling for decentralization of care and depathologization of trans identities, while on the other side, more conservative calls for limiting access to gender care are getting louder. The precarious nature of the environment also complicates future access to assisted reproductive technologies, where bioethical questions regarding trans people's rights to reproductive health are still in full swing. The dynamic nature of the social environment transgender care takes place in can and does provide obstacles in the implementation of new biotechnologies in the treatment process. However, this dynamic nature of the social environment and its effect on transgender treatment is a two-way street. Public debate and political awareness of trans issues can and does also activate change in medical policies and can broaden access to gender-affirming care, fertility-preserving techniques, and assisted reproductive technologies. When we look at the construction of new reproductive care paths, we must research and understand the socio-cultural environment care takes place in and the constraints and possibilities inherent to it. By creating gender-friendly environments in clinics, we can take away barriers for trans people to make use of fertility-preserving techniques and assisted reproductive technologies. Organizing educational events for practitioners working in fertility clinics and local hospitals would be a great start to increase knowledge about trans reproductive health and rights. Creating more space in education to talk about gender diversity and alternative families can help build perspective for young trans people and normalize thinking about trans parenthood and families. Thank you for listening. I'll be taking questions now. If you have any more questions or want to discuss the topic further, don't hesitate and get in touch.
Thank you. That was a really high quality recording. I'm very impressed. Like, it was really good quality. Thank you, Silke, for sharing that.
Thanks for having me.
No, of course. Lovely. And now we are going to go to our last presentation by Sterre. Sterre is also originally Dutch, and she graduated at the University of Amsterdam as well. You can now go ahead with your presentation.
Oops. Sorry. Yeah, there we go. Okay, thank you. So I'm Sterre van Ede, and this past spring I did my master's research studying pregnancy care interactions among refugees and their healthcare providers. And I did this research in conjunction with a project from the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam called Egalité. And the mission of Egalité is to understand why in certain areas in the Netherlands, there are specifically areas concentrated with refugees and asylum-seeking centers, there are worse birth statistics. And we can think of worse birth statistics as premature babies, difficulties with the delivery of a baby, gestational diabetes, and perinatal mortality. And Egalité's research is still continuing in both quantitative and qualitative forms. But my contribution to this research was to understand what is going on between the healthcare provider and pregnant refugee. And in research, the term refugee is used quite broadly. So during this presentation, I refer to either asylum seekers or status holders, which are refugees with a Dutch residency permit. And from other research conducted in European countries regarding this topic, and by conducting my own literature review, I quickly realized that cultural and language differences between many refugees and their healthcare provider influence pregnancy, both the pregnancy experience for women and their pregnancy care. And coming from a very anthropological background, my question became, how do care interactions shape the pregnancy experience of refugees in the Netherlands? And to help me understand this question, I used the two sub-questions. How does communication, particularly when mediated through an interpreter, influence care practices experienced by pregnant women and their healthcare providers? And how do healthcare providers' understandings of pregnant women's backgrounds shape how they care for pregnant refugees? And I began my research doing 4 observation days at midwifery practices and asylum centers around the Netherlands. And going into my research partner and I already had participant confirmation from midwifery practices across the country whom agreed to being interviewed and observed. And I ended up conducting 9 interviews with 9 different midwives. And following, I conducted 5 interviews with refugees. 3 were status holders whom I recruited through the help of a foundation in Rotterdam called New Home. And I conducted interviews with 2 asylum seekers whom I recruited on one of my observation days at an asylum-seeking center. There were 2 main themes that I found in my research and data analysis. The first one, as I titled in one of my thesis chapters, communicating, interpreting, and hands and feet. And under this findings chapter, I discuss how communication both hindered and enhanced the pregnancy care experience for both the pregnant woman and her provider. And some logistical information that's important to note regarding this research is that the Dutch government provides free access to interpreters via the telephone for asylum seekers during their appointments, but they don't provide free access for status holders. And the main takeaways I would like for you all to understand is that, 1, there's quite a bit of information being lost during these appointments. And sometimes that's due to the fact that the midwife and interpreter don't quite understand one another. The interpreter has difficulty relaying medical information. There are specific dialects within a language where the woman and interpreter don't understand one another. And this generally has an overall effect on the quality and continuity of her pregnancy care. Secondly, healthcare providers are the ones who organize interpreters for appointments, and out of neglect or lack of time, some providers don't arrange female interpreters. And so in instances when a male interpreter is present during these appointments, women felt so uncomfortable that they wouldn't ask any questions regarding their pregnancy or communicate with their provider. Thirdly, seeing that status holders don't have access to free interpreters, they're given the main responsibility to find someone who can translate during their appointments. Otherwise, they're left to having a difficult time communicating with their provider. But on a more positive note, interpreters allowed some women to feel like they could finally properly communicate with someone, such as their midwife. And so there were many instances that I observed, and also during my interviews with midwives, where they discussed how conversations in the consultation room went beyond the scope of a pregnancy and really just discussed how is the woman doing in her pregnancy, how is she doing in her asylum journey thus far. And because it was the first time for some women throughout their entire process of coming to the Netherlands where they could open up and speak with someone. And the second theme that was important that I found, that I call the importance of background caring and giving them a voice, is that many midwives used a patient-centered care approach. And by this, I mean that they view a patient holistically and is attentive to the various interrelated cultural, political, and social surroundings and how that might influence a refugee's pregnancy experience. And there were certain midwives who found it incredibly important to ask women what they wanted, what they needed in their pregnancy, and how could the midwife create a care process for the woman that was personalized. And midwives found that this group of women were not generally used to being asked this question. And I found it really beautiful to see how a partnership was being formed between the midwife and the woman that created a pregnancy care process that was not only enjoyable and pleasant and safe, but also increased the patient-provider satisfaction in the overall experience. The other side of getting to know a woman's background, let's say, is that there were some instances when I noticed othering and stereotyping coming from the midwife, and this seemed to have an effect on how she formed a connection with that woman. And although my specific research sample of refugees was quite small, the asylum seekers I spoke to felt as though they were really uncomfortable in waiting rooms, asylum centers, and situations with their midwives, and they felt almost unworthy of the care they were receiving and felt as though they were unwelcomed into the Netherlands. And this had an overall effect that created anxiety and stress and generally a negative experience of their pregnancy. I would strongly argue that this research only scratched the surface of a very complex issue, and there are many interrelated parts, but there are two policy recommendations that I firmly stand behind. The first one, there needs to be free access to interpreters for status holders. And this needs to be number one on the agenda for Dutch lawmakers, because I think the fact that free interpreters are not given to this population are forcing some women to bring their children to act as an interpreter, forcing women to skip appointments out of shame that they don't speak the Dutch language, or forcing women to find someone they're not comfortable sharing medical information with. And this affects their ability to communicate with their healthcare provider, having an overall, which ultimately is violating their human right to good and quality pregnancy care here in the Netherlands. And the second one is to offer training in refugee-related aspects. And by this, I mean, first, provide access to quality interpreters who work with pregnant refugees and healthcare providers, provide specific training to midwives on how to provide pregnancy care while working with an interpreter via the telephone, and create workshops with midwives to network and share advice on how to provide good care for this population that covers important topics, because it's quite a unique type of pregnancy care, and how to create an open mind among midwives who are now having to care for many different backgrounds, ethnicities, and cultures that are different to the average Dutch woman's experience. And I'm hoping, but I'm also thinking that with the continuation of Egalité's research and with conferences like ShareNet International that provides the space to share this type of research, I believe that the Netherlands is capable in improving and providing good quality pregnancy care to refugees who absolutely deserve this human right. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very interesting research and much needed as well, I would say. Well, thank you to all the speakers. Those are for sure very relevant researchers for policy and practice. And with this note, I would like to introduce our expert discussant now. Judith is the research lead and works on program development at Rutgers, Center of Expertise on SRHR. She's leading a team of SRHR researchers and PMEL advisors for Rutgers work in the Netherlands, as well as internationally. She's also responsible for initiating and facilitating development of new programs. So welcome, Judith. Now I would like to give you the floor to answer the question, how do these research findings and recommendations for policy and practice resonate? How could they be taken up? This for every speaker. And then I would like to ask you, would you like to start by drawing links between research, policy, and practice from Elena's presentation?
Yeah, so thanks. Well, first of all, before I start, congratulations for the four presenters for the excellent presentations and the work done. Yeah, and let me just go through them one by one in order of presentation. In my response, I will pop up some questions. It doesn't mean that you need to answer them all, so maybe it's just sometimes maybe food for thought, or at least some of the things that I was thinking of while reading your abstracts and listening to your presentations. So maybe Elena, of course, start off with you. It's a very interesting and relevant topic, and I imagine it's not only relevant for pregnant women in asylum situations, given that mental health problems do occur, I assume, among a larger group. So the methods that you use, the RHS 15, I imagine that it is used broader. So I would... You indicate that it is that you wanted to transculturally validate the tool, and I was just wondering what your thoughts are, whether it's culturally sensitive enough. I saw that you interviewed 8 women, which is, well, of course, a low number when you talk about validation. I believe you had 6 or 7 different countries of origin. So how did that influence your findings, and what would you do in terms of, you know, understanding better the cultural aspect of the tool to measure mental health, and whether pregnant women are a kind of a special group within that, and whether you need any specific items to include in the tool, for example. And another thing completely different, I thought of, you know, you advocate for using this tool in screening, but I also can imagine that the screening itself can be a burden for women. And so I think it is very important that the healthcare system around it and other forms of support are ready and available to address any of the mental health problems that do come to the surface after the screening. So how did you take this into account in your study? It's one of the ethical aspects of doing such a research study, so among these 8 women. But also, how do you see that when it comes to rolling out the screening for this group, and whether it's possible to provide that broader system of care? So those were a few of the thoughts that I had with Elena's presentation. Let me go to, is it okay if I continue directly with the rest, Gaia? Or do you want me to go back to Elena first for her to respond?
Yeah, I think it would be nice now if Elena could respond before maybe she forgets her points. Go ahead.
Yes, I'll try to respond briefly. So the RHS 15, the tool I used, is actually already transculturally validated for refugees. Maybe I didn't mention it clearly in the presentation. And what we did, it was to assess it whether it was proper within as pregnant asylum seekers. So our specific population group, and 8 people, it's a small number, but for in order for us to reach a saturation within qualitative research was enough. So that's a very brief answer to the first question. Regarding the second question, we actually had a psychologist present with us to all the interviews we performed, and we when we thought that some women might need extra help or care after the interview, we directed them to the current midwife that was taking care of them, and told the midwife that she should start some kind of care project with a psychologist after. Of course, this after getting consent from the woman. Within Asylum Seeker Center, there's actually quite a network of either a psychologist or nurses with a psychological background, where women could be directed after such a screening test, and they could also be sent to psychiatrists, whether this could be seen as necessary from the midwife. So there's already, let's say, this network, it's already there. What we need is to be able to detect the women who need this care.
Thanks so much for responding, Elena. Let me go to the second one, which from Saskia. Really original study, I think. It offers a new perspective on tourism in Amsterdam, at least for me. And one of the things, so I found it really interesting also to see that it allows them to be more picky in their clients, which is a form of protection. I thought that was a very interesting finding from this. And well, Dutch people are seen as cheap. Well, what's new? I thought, but that's no, I'm just getting there. Well, what I thought it would be interesting to maybe dig a little bit deeper into the recommendation of promote tourism, and especially given that for Amsterdam, that might not resonate so much in policy, because Amsterdam is also suffering from too much tourism in a way. So I was thinking, if you really want the policymakers to be heard, how could you differentiate or think along? And apart from, I think a major step would already be if policymakers would actually take this view and the benefit for the sex workers into account in making their policy. But maybe also not saying, the general promotion of tourism, but maybe differentiate. You already made a little bit of a start in your presentation, saying, well, the better pay, those who pay better, so the Americans and the businessmen. So, I think that type of thinking would help you to be heard in your if you would do advocacy towards policymakers, to kind of say like, hey, well, can we ensure that kind of the business conferences are promoted some way or another? I think a lot of businesses would agree anyhow. So maybe that's a little bit the way to go, rather than just generally say promote tourism, because I think a lot of people would then stop listening. Yeah, so let me keep it at that. But yeah, I thought it was a very interesting perspective. Thanks for that. I don't know if Saskia wants to respond.
Otherwise, I don't want to interrupt, but I noticed that we are going a bit over time. So would it be okay for all the speakers if we just went on with Judith's comments without maybe as many reactions? And then we still have a bit of a space for the Q&A. Yeah? Okay, perfect. Then you can go on, Judith.
Okay, thanks. So up to the third one, Silke, also a very interesting topic, very relevant also when looking from Rutgers' perspective, where we are working on kind of the tailored care idea and making sure that everyone feels welcome and addressed to in a very good way when seeking care. I was just thinking a little bit about the heteronormativity, and I was wondering whether it is just the gender binary element of it that is kind of problematic, because, you know, given that you need a male and female reproductive system for fertility reasons, obviously, but or whether there is also a element of the heterosexual norm to it, and I was just wondering whether it's just gender binary or both. And well, just given the practical and policy relevance, and I think you did already a great job in your presentation. I first read, of course, your abstract, and I come a bit of an anthropological background myself, and I know that sometimes there's a bit of a challenge in translating the more very abstract concepts of anthropology towards practitioners. So how do you kind of translate that so that the practitioners also understand your findings very well? I'm just very curious how you think health workers should deal with the younger trans people pre-puberty, and how do parents come in there when it comes to this topic? Let me stop here. There's a lot more to discuss on the topic, but I know it's time. So those were a few of my thoughts around Silke's presentation. Then the last one from Sterre. Well, I think the gap is clear and the topic is very relevant. Communication and trust are important conditions to improve the quality of care. It also sounds a bit predictable, or as an open door, obviously. That would be a result. And well, based on your abstract, I was thinking, could you do with a little bit more specifics, which you did give a bit more in your presentation, so that was good. I was wondering whether there's also a differentiation between groups, because now kind of there's all, again, pregnant, asylum seekers and even status holders together. It creates this one group. Well, there are so many different ethnicities behind it and cultural groups. So I was wondering how that comes into play, and also if you would need to take into account the unintended pregnancies part, so the unintendedness of pregnancies versus the intended pregnancies. And maybe sometimes the unfavorable situations in which women may have become pregnant, for example, as a result of sexual violence. So how that all comes into play when it comes about communication and trust. And of course, you ask for free access to interpreters and training to midwives, but I assume you've already seen some promising factors among some of the midwives. So I was wondering, what could midwives already do differently themselves to improve the care provided, irrespective of any of the, possible policy changes or extra support care support systems before those are in place. And yeah, so let me maybe stop. Well, one last thing. I think maybe Elena and Sterre could also discuss how the two studies come together, given that they talk about the same group of women, obviously, and how that strengthens each other. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Judith. I'm sorry that I had to cut you short, but for sure there was a lot of food for thought for everyone after your interactions. And especially a good point about Elena and Sterre. Also, last year there was a collaboration between two students. So I don't know, good for you to know. And now I would like to give the space for the audience to ask questions and to react to the presentations or to even the points that were raised by Judith. So please feel free to leave any questions in the chat or to raise your hand directly or to just speak. And yeah. And if we have no questions, in that case, we would just give the room to Sterre, Saskia, and Silke to reply. But otherwise, we would love to hear your thoughts. No questions at all? And by the way, I remembered, I saw a question before for Elena in the chat. Maybe that's, but you already answered that one. Okay, good. Okay, then there is a first question in the chat. Did you encounter some difficulties communicating during the interviews, Elena and Sterre?
Yeah, I can go first. During the interviews I had with both asylum seekers, they spoke very good English, so that wasn't an issue. But I did notice that, you know, as a researcher, and you know, these women are coming from countries that have war, have conflict. Their journeys to get to the Netherlands are quite dangerous in general, and so when you're asking a woman about everything going on in her life and her pregnancy, there were certain situations during these interviews where I felt like, okay, I maybe need to step back and look at myself as a researcher and what emotional toll is this having on the woman. And there was one interview that I actually stopped halfway through because I noticed that, okay, the questions that I'm asking are maybe doing more harm than good. And we stopped the interview and we just shared a cup of tea and we discussed everything but the research that I was doing. And I think that has an important point to my whole research, is that some of these women have no social network, no support, and they just want someone to talk to and to check in on them.
Thank you, Sterre, for your intervention. I found myself in a similar situation because talking about mental health with a pregnant asylum seeker who just arrived in the Netherlands is definitely not an easy topic. Well, I was there with a team of another researcher and a psychologist, and we managed to get through the whole interview all of the times, and even if we had some moments that were quite emotional, but we just took all the time necessary for the woman to get back to herself. And we also shared tea and cookies, and but was I didn't encounter any other difficulties. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your answers. We have another question from Billy for Silke. You discussed how some people want to start their transition before they reach puberty, but how this offers difficulties in terms of opportunities for freezing their egg sperms. What will be your recommendation in this case? Also, I understand you need to pay a yearly fee for freezing eggs or sperm. What role does this economic aspect play in their decision making?
Okay, thank you for your question, Billy. It actually ties in very nicely with Judith's question about how to deal with pubescent trans people. And while there's a big difference, of course, in difficulties, if you're talking about someone with gynecological organs, or if you're talking about trans girls and women, for trans boys, there are a lot of options because the organs can stay in the body until a later stage in the transitioning process, because gender affirming operations typically don't take place before someone reaches the age of 18 and 19. And if a trans boy or man does not experience gender dysphoria about his organs inside the body, they can stay there without any harm. And testosterone doesn't affect the uterus and ovaries, so you could still make use of your reproductive organs later in life. Well, this is not the case for trans girls. Feminizing hormones do impact semen quality. I'm not a doctor, but I've witnessed so many fertility counseling sessions that it's a difficult situation because they are kind of forced to make the decision at a very, very early age. And what complicates the decision even more is the lack of representation in family imaginaries, because it makes it incredibly difficult. Oh, I'm so sorry. It makes it incredibly difficult. It is, of course, it's an impossible question, right? To ask a 12-year-old girl if she wants to start a family in the future and if she wants to freeze sperm, especially when her body is not yet able to produce sperm. So yeah, what they do in the gender clinic is you have conversations about the topic, right? You include the parents. It's always the most important thing to keep communication going and to create a treatment plan where everyone is on board. And in a lot of cases, it's just personalized care. It's just weighing positives against negatives and seeing what's important for the individual right in front of you. And the economic aspect of freezing in the Netherlands is, I would say, I can't see what someone's bank account is, of course, but it's about a yearly fee of 40 euros. So yeah, it's not such a hefty fee as you see in the US. And let me check the rest of the question. Yeah, what I would recommend, like, look, the fertility questions for younger trans patients, they stay, yeah, it's just, they stay hard, right? There's not an easy solution for it. But I'm so sorry, my partner keeps calling, but I'm gonna pick that up later. Yeah. I'm so out of it. But maybe we can move on.
Yeah, perfect. No, also Billy saying that you've answered her questions fully. So thank you so much, Silke. And I saw that there is another question for Matthias, but I'm afraid that for now we need to round up the session since we only have 3 minutes left. So first of all, I would like to thank once again everyone for all your very insightful comments and presentations there, and also the audience for being here. And now I would like to make an announcement as well, which Nicole already put in the chat. There's gonna be a digital zine made by a graphic design queer collective based in Italy called Frammenti. So please stay tuned with ShareNet Netherlands and ShareNet International to see the outcome. And if you're curious about how it was last year, you can check out the link in the chat. And also, I would like to remind you that there are other sessions part of this conference. And one is actually taking place in 15 minutes at 3 Amsterdam time, of course. And it's going to be about ShareNet Colombia. So if you're interested, please still register. And also don't forget about the networking opportunities. And There was already one this morning, but there is also going to be another one later in the day at 4:15, also Amsterdam time. So please come, and you get the opportunity to chat with the speakers and to chat with the sharing team and to ask more questions or to do some networking. And we are using the platform Remo to do so. And in order to do that, yeah, it's just an online networking platform. So there are different tables, and you can move around the room and you can double click on the participants, and then you can talk to them directly via video call. That's good for you to know. And also, we always care to know what your opinion and feedback is on our events. So please fill in the form that Nicole shared in the chat and let us know how we can improve, or I don't know, also good things, I guess. And then please, if you want to stay connected with ShareNet International, we have our digital platform that we also shared before, and you can sign up as a member if you like. But now it's perfect timing, actually. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It was a very nice session, and I look forward to seeing you at the networking event. Thank you so much. Goodbye. Thank you.